Good afternoon. I'm Erin Fletcher, Director of Interpretation and Adult Programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Welcome to the annual Dr. John and Helen Collis Lecture. I'm delighted that you all have joined us this year on Case Western Reserve's campus while the Cleveland Museum of Art is undergoing renovation on its Horace Kelly Art Foundation North Lobby and the Susan M. Kaskin Education Gallery and Lobby. I'd like to begin by thanking our donors. This endowed lecture is made possible by the Dr. John and Helen Collis Family Endowment Fund. We're grateful to the Collis family for this gift, which honors their Greek heritage as well as a longtime interest in Greek culture. Although Dr. Collis passed before my time with the museum, I understand that his love of people, intellectual curiosity, and interest in lifelong learning were inspirations for this endowment. As a result of the generosity of our donors and the steadfast project management of Mary Beth Lekis, the museum is pleased to bring an outstanding scholar in these fields to Cleveland each year. This year, we welcome Dr. John K. Papadopoulos, Distinguished Professor of Classics at UCLA and Director of the Excavations of the Athenian Agora at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. To introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to invite Seth Pevnik, CMA's Curator of Greek and Roman Art, Chair of the Art of Ancient Mediterranean, Africa, and Europe to 1800, as well as Decorative Art, and our interim co-chief curator to the podium. Seth began his tenure at CMA as a curator of Greek and Roman art in March of 2019, overseeing, researching, developing, and presenting the collection of art of the ancient Mediterranean world, including the art of Egypt and the ancient Near East. In April 2024, together with Chief Conservator Sarah Scaturo, he was named interim co-chief curator. In this capacity, until the arrival of our new Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Andrea Durstein, in December, he and Sarah supervised the entire collections division, including curatorial, conservation, collections management, library and archives, and music and performing arts. Please help me welcome Seth Pevnik.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you everyone for taking time on a somewhat rainy and dreary Cleveland Sunday afternoon to join us for today's Collis Lecture. I would like first to reiterate Erin's thanks and then add a few words of my own before we get to the main event. As some of you know, the Collis Lecture is among my favorite annual events at the Cleveland Museum of Art, or in this case here on the Case Western Reserve University campus. It's hard to believe, but it was way back in 2015, long before I had the privilege of joining the CMA staff, I had the honor of delivering the Collis Lecture. And I got some sense then of how special Cleveland and the CMA truly are. And now I look forward to it every year as a time to celebrate our shared cultural heritage and the universal importance of Greek art, history, and civilization. And I especially look forward to it every other year when I get the chance to invite a great scholar to speak here in Cleveland. And today I can tell you we're in for a real treat. Our speaker, as Erin said, is John K. Papadopoulos, who is certainly a great scholar and, as you'll soon see, a great speaker. He's Distinguished Professor of Classics and Archaeology at UCLA, where he has taught since 2002. Prior to that, John was a curator in the Antiquities department at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and before that, Deputy Director of the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Sydney and has directed and co-directed numerous archaeological excavations, including at Toroni and Methoni, both in northern Greece, and at Lufken in Albania, where I spent several summers working under his supervision. Currently, John splits his time between UCLA and the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, where he serves as director of the excavations of the Athenian Agora. For many years before being named director of those excavations, he has studied and published thousands of finds from past excavations in the Agora, particularly from the early Iron Age. John is an extremely prolific scholar and author, having written or edited more than a dozen books and well over 100 articles, so I'm not going to list them all here. He's focused on topics ranging from the Aegean Bronze Age through the early Iron Age and into the classical period and beyond, as well as theoretical issues that cut across chronological divides, such as colonialism and the construction of value. He's a recognized expert in many of those areas, and I think he'll touch on several of them today, including funerary archaeology, ancient ceramics, and the topography of ancient Athens. Before I turn the stage over to John, though, I would be remiss if I didn't add that he's also an extremely generous teacher, mentor, and colleague, as I can personally attest. More than 20 years ago, John, together with his wife, Professor Sarah Morris, who's also here today and is also a great scholar, welcomed me to UCLA as a young graduate student. They oversaw my work in classrooms and archaeological sites and museums, and John served as my primary advisor through the completion of my dissertation. So, for better or for worse, that means he's one of the few people in the world who read every word of my dissertation, I think. And it's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be standing here, I wouldn't be the curator of Greek and Roman art if it weren't for John and Sarah and their generosity. But more importantly for all of you, as I said, John is a gifted speaker. I think he communicates his knowledge, but also his passion for archaeology and the many generations of people who have come before us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Papadopoulos to the stage to speak on the art of antiquity, objects and their biographies from the Athenian Agora.
Can you hear me in the back there? Yeah? Well, thank you, Seth, for that most generous and overinflated introduction. It's a privilege and great pleasure for me to be here today as the Dr. John and Helen Collis Family Lecturer. And I'd like to thank the entire Collis family, many of whom are here in front of me, for their generosity and for hosting a wonderful dinner last night where I got to meet many of them and to get to know them pretty well. So thank you, thank you. So what I want to do today, let me just turn this thing on. What I want to do today is going to be really a little strange, okay? And it's going to be a little strange because I want to do it from my own background and from my own perspective. So it comes from my background as a university teacher, both at the University of Sydney and at UCLA, as a field archaeologist, and I've had the privilege and great pleasure to work in a number of places. Seth mentioned a few of them, primarily in northern Greece, but I've also dug in Albania, in southern Italy at Francavilla Maritima, worked on repatriation of finds from there, and as a young graduate and undergraduate student, I cut my teeth learning archaeology, working on Australian Aboriginal rock art. And in many ways, I'm sorry I didn't stay there because it was a lot of fun. But once I went to Greece and I figured out that I kind of belonged there and I could speak the language, the rest was history. So it comes from my own background and also the fact that I'm the current director of the Athenian Agora excavations. So I want to actually begin by showing you my office in Athens. And I also want to show a few shots of Seth in the field when he was a young man. So this is the wonderful building, the Stoa of Attalus, which is my office. And my office is on the upper floor Let me do it with the cursor so people on either side. So my office is just about there. The red square that you see is the area that we're currently excavating, okay? And you can see the Athenian Acropolis in the background, and the best preserved temple in Greece, the Hephaestion, just there. So 38 hectares, it's a huge site. And it's just, especially during the excavation season, the bummer is that I have to get up at 5 a.m. Sarah is, quietly in bed. I have to sneak out into the lounge room where I've got my clothes, and, I have to change and do everything in the living room. But walking there in the morning when the whole streets of Athens are empty is a real pleasure. The Stoa of Atlas, incidentally, was made in the 2nd century BC, and it was reconstructed as the museum and the storage area of the American School of Classical Studies Agora excavations in the 1950s. So it's my age. She and I were born within 2 years of one another. And one of my jobs now is basically to refurbish her. I have to do that from go to woe. It's also, incidentally, particularly this area here, the home of democracy. This is the first time on Earth where a democratic system of government prevailed. And it was all the more remarkable because it was in a sea surrounded by cultures led by kings, by pharaohs, by single males. And here was the first democracy. So here's Seth. It's sort of disgraceful. Even though he's in Cleveland, he still goes for the Cardinals in St. Louis. There's, you always wore that cap. I've got some more really embarrassing shots of him, including one of him getting like an injection up, in his butt. But I won't go there. This is a mixed audience. And, okay, it's going to be a little strange. Oh no, I went backwards, sorry. Forward. No, I'm sorry, guys. Oh. I've done my office in Athens. Okay, let's start there. Does anybody know the word to paint in Greek? Yeah, what is it? You put them on the spot, sir. What is the word in ancient Greek to paint? Well, it's graphein in the infinitive, to paint. Okay? Does anybody know the word in ancient Greek to write?
Same word.
It's the same word. So, in Greek, as in several other languages, including the American language Quechua in the Andes, there is absolutely no distinction between writing and painting. And so as you can see, the word can mean to write, to draw, to paint, to sketch, to incise, to inscribe. It means all of those things. And we can see this wonderfully on this vase, which is one of the most celebrated craters in Athenian black figure. It's the great Francois vase, dates to 570 BC. We know the names of the potter and painter who made it. They signed. But it's a veritable encyclopedia of Greek mythology, and every figure is not only painted, it's named. Look at this dog. Okay, it's lying on its back. It's been disemboweled by the Caledonian boar. This is a mean mother. Okay, you don't want to mess with this pig. Okay, it's killed this dog. It's killed another man. It's disemboweled the dog. But you see, just above the dog, lying back, dying, the name, Ormenos, attack. That's the dog's name. And here's another dog, Methepon, forehead, front line. Again, this concept of attack. So it's not just the heroes and the heroines that are named, but it's the dog. And Paul Krenschmer, a German scholar at the beginning of the 20th century, wrote a book about dogs' names in ancient Greece. So if you're having a problem with naming your next dog, you know, you can look it up and maybe you can get a nice ancient Greek name. The book is written in German, but the names are given in Greek. And this concept of writing and painting, the Greeks take to an enormous height. And in really, really short order, writing and painting enters a completely unimaginable conceptual level. And it's done this for the first time in world history. And these are not royal or sacred scribes working for an elite person. What did I do? These are school scenes on a cup by the vase painter Duras, who normally signs his name as Doris. And he may be, there's one in about 3 or 4 chances that he may be a woman, but that's unclear. And you can see the school scene, they're reading. This is not a Mac, although you might think it is. It's a diptych, and these students over here, let me use my cursor. The students over here are also learning music, and they're learning music on the other side as well.
I don't think we can see the cursor. It doesn't show for us.
Oh, it doesn't show, so I'll point, but only, I don't know if anybody can see it. So here's a detail of the cup, and what I really want to focus on are the letters there. What's painted and what's written. That's its date. And this is what it says in Greek. And there are a few spelling mistakes in there. And a scholar and colleague actually wrote an article saying, well, this is because the vase painter wasn't very good at Greek. And this was perhaps the students practicing. I don't think that's the case. I think students practicing would not be writing on a papyrus scroll or on a parchment scroll. They would be writing on one of those diptychs, which is a wax box. But this is what it says, and it's in verse, it's in hexameter, it's a poem. My muse, the river Scamander, Scamandron, and the Greek word to sing, ianden. Add Achilles, and you're all set. I mean, this may as well be the beginning of Homer. Here it is, on a pot dating to the early 5th century BC. And early alphabetical script can be written from left to right, from right to left. And if it's written vertically, you could flip the letters around any which way that you like. And they also have a system of writing called boustrophodon, where the first line is from left to right, the second line is from right to left, the third line is from left to right, and there's no word breaks. There's no punctuation. You have to know the Greek, and you have to know it by context. And it's also the point that, and this is the real difference between history and archaeology. History, literature, is written by the winners. Okay? It's not written by the losers. To be a poor girl born on the wrong side of the tracks in classical Athens, was not to experience Plato's world. And in fact, the ugly underbelly of this Athenian democracy was the same ugly underbelly of the founding fathers of the United States. Women, enslaved peoples, and resident aliens did not have a say. And I was actually shocked to find out that in Switzerland, women did not get the vote until the early 70s. 1970s. Wow. And as an archaeologist, one of the things that I always want to impress upon my students is how we should be reading texts. And oftentimes, we should be reading texts not for what their authors said or wished to say, but for all of those unarticulated assumptions, all of that cultural baggage that the text carries. Homer doesn't talk about women per se, about the role of women. But if you read Homer and you read between the lines, you get a really good idea of what women's work and women's lives were like in the 8th century BC. So the alphabet was first developed in the Near East, in the Levant, in basically what is today southern Israel and the Gaza Strip. Okay? And it was developed perhaps as early as 1800 BC. The amount of literature we have in early alphabetic Hebrew is minimal. It's rarely more than 2 or 3 words. Oftentimes it's just names. The critical issue is that the alphabet was adopted by the Greeks from the Phoenicians. So it's the same as the Phoenician and the Aramaic alphabet. The Aramaic is what Jesus spoke during his own life. And it was this that was adopted and adapted into the specific context of ancient Greece. And this is really the important point. And what the Greeks did with it, they picked up this ball and they ran with it. For the first time in world history, writing was not limited to a scribal or ruling elite. It became democratized. It became a tool that could be exploited by anyone. Henceforth, and this is the first time in world history that this has happened, a bard like Homer could reach across the ages and describe a heroic or partly true world. A woman like Sappho could write poetry. A farmer like Hesiod could write about farming, works and days, and even about the birth of the gods. And a playwright, be my guest, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, could write high tragedy or slapstick comedy. A seasoned traveler or anthropologist like Herodotus could recall whole cultures that he chanced upon and described. And a failed and frustrated general like Thucydides could write the history of the Peloponnesian War. And any male citizen could scratch onto the surface of a vase the name of the person that they wished to ostracize. What the Athenians really hated most was too much power concentrated into the hands of one man. So every year, if they had a quorum of 6,000 citizens, they had an ostracism. They could ostracize somebody. And if the ostracism went forward, that person had to make themselves scarce for 10 years. Their family could stay in Athens, their property was completely intact, but they had to leave. Last August, it was actually on my birthday, I had the privilege and great pleasure of taking Justice Sonia Sotomayor for a tour around the Agora. And I said, not with tongue-in-cheek, I wished we still had ostracism today. And I looked at her, and there was this wry smile on her face, and she was sagely nodding. She didn't say a word, but I knew what she was talking about. And look at these. These are all ostracisms for the great Themistocles, the hero of the Battle of Salamis. Pericles, the son of Xanthippus. Cimon, the guy who built the Stoa Poikile, the son of Miltiades. Miltiades was the hero of the Battle of Marathon. Aristides, the son of Lysimachus. Here they are, the great statesmen of classical Athens. And here's some more. So, writing and painting. The ancient Greeks did it. We saw it on the Francois vase and on the Duras cup. But what about later books? And one of the things that I've always been interested in is that most early travelers who visited Greece in the 17th, 18th, 19th, even 20th century, even today, I use him all the time, would read Pausanias, because he describes where he went, and he describes, like in gory detail, the artwork that he saw. It's just fabulous. He describes paintings, statues, buildings, all sorts of things. And even as a student, I always wondered, were there pictures in his books? We don't have any of the original manuscripts intact. We just have later versions that are copied by monks. And this is a view of one of the monasteries of Mount Athos. This is the monastery of Dochiario. Women are not allowed on this peninsula. Somehow, female animals are not allowed, but they have milk, they make yogurt. So, and this is one of the manuscripts that I actually photographed when I was in Dochiario. But if you look at early manuscripts, and there's plenty of other people in this audience that could lecture on these better than I could, look at all these pictures that go with it. Saints, animals, horses, donkeys. And there's a wonderful book by Michael Camille, the late lamented Michael Camille, about the images on the edge of these medieval manuscripts. And some of them are really raunchy. Check this out. You know, in a religious manuscript, like, here's a young person praying and a monkey trying to give the person a hard time. And what's all this about? What's this about? Images on the edge. So by the medieval period, we do get books with image and text. And I suspect we also had that in Antiquity. How would Theophrastus, who wrote Periphyton Historia, an inquiry into plants, how could he do it with just words, without actually showing, making a drawing of a plant? So, what about scientific images? In the first minute book of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 1717, The first secretary, William Stukeley, wrote, "Without drawing or designing, the study of antiquities or any other science is lame and imperfect." Not only is archaeology without illustration a lame and imperfect discipline, but the manner in which both earlier antiquaries and contemporary scholars view or even approach the past and put it on record is a complex process that shapes and determines the way we all look at and study antiquity. It's a little bit like the core of quantum physics, Schrödinger's cat. And it's in a box. And you ask the question, is it alive or dead? Once you ask the question, you become part of the thought experiment. And this is what Albert Einstein had a problem with and said, well, you know, God does not play dice. And Niels Bohr said, well, he may. Or she may. So, I want to do a brief overview of images. And particularly, there was one slide that got garbled at the beginning, but it was about cultural biography, the social life of things. And many of us are interested are in this room today because of your own interests and your own passions on ancient things. And the Cleveland Museum of Art has a spectacular collection of ancient and more contemporary materials. And part of the story is that the value of those objects is socially constructed. It doesn't come down like in 10 Commandments. Every society makes its own values, conceptual and economic. And so I want to show you some pictures of some firsts in ancient Greece. This drawing, this illustration, is the earliest illustration we have of an island, any island in Greece. It's the island of Lefkas, and it's by a Florentine monk, Cristoforo Buondelmonte. You see his dates. And he was among the very first to attempt cartography of ancient places. Okay? So this is the earliest map we have of a Greek island. He visited many and he drew many. You see this? This is the earliest map I know of the city which is now known as Istanbul, which is a corruption of the Greek, estin poli, in the town, but which was known for far longer periods as Constantinople or Byzantium. And it became as a major settlement only as a trading port, probably in the 7th century BC, if not earlier. Okay? And then there's this guy, Kyriakos of Ancona, Syriac of Ancona. And he visited Greece on several times at several different occasions in the 15th century. You see this miserable drawing. This is the earliest drawing we have in captivity of the Parthenon. For many years, this was the only one we had. And he himself traded in all sorts of manuscripts and small antiquities, particularly things that he can put in his pocket and carry away. And he also began copying inscriptions in his own native Italy already when he was a young man. And he continued doing this when he visited Greece. And he had a really radical thought. The monuments and inscriptions are more faithful witnesses of classical antiquity than are the texts of the ancient writers. Sort of saying, up yours, Thucydides. And he made these drawings, Aristotle and Hermes, both from the island of Delos, when he visited Delos in the 15th century. Now, it's not just a story of Western travelers. We also have Eastern travelers. And this guy is Evliya Çelebi, and he's in many ways the veritable Pausanias of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, the finest description in writing of the Parthenon is probably his, or it's the finest description that I've read. But there were many others. There was Jacob Spon and George Wheeler, and here they are in this imaginary photograph. And believe you me, Athens never looked like that. Okay? It's just made up. But there they are, being shown around and going around looking at the monuments of Athens. So Jacob Spon wrote in French. He was from Lyon. George Wheeler wrote in English. He was from London. And Evliya Çelebi wrote in Ottoman Turkish. And Jacob Spon, in many ways, in his book, The Journey to Italy, Dalmatia, Greece, and the Levant, really came up with a lot of firsts. He was the first person that I know of that used the term archaeology in the preface of his book on inscriptions. And he copied more than 2,000 Greek and Latin inscriptions and made drawings of numerous statues, reliefs, and other antiquities. He actually had an even funkier thought. Okay? And this is where the social life of things comes in. Can things, objects, places, lead a social life like we do? And the answer is yes. And Jacob Spon, I think, was the first person to articulate it, in some sense. It is also by means of objects that the ancients transmitted religion, history, politics, arts, and the sciences. He's talking about the agency of objects. Arjun Appadurai wrote a whole book about it, the social life of things. And Spon constantly compared and contrasted the evidence of text with what he himself could observe in the field. Here is a map that he made of Athens. It's still really, really useful. I actually used it for the topography of Athens. And this equally miserable drawing of the Parthenon was the one that most people had used in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And the reason for that is that Jacob Spon, George Wheeler, and Evliya Çelebi were three of the last people that ever saw the Parthenon before it was blown up. Okay? Better the crescent than the cross. The Ottoman Turks were held on to the Acropolis. They were in charge of the Acropolis. They were the governors of the town of Athens. And the Venetian general Morosini came to Athens in 1687, September of 1687, set up his cannons on the Hill of the Muses and started firing at the Acropolis. The Ottomans made one fatal error. They put all of their gunpowder, all of their munitions, as well as 700 women, children, and old men into the Parthenon in the belief that nobody would bomb a religious building. It was a mosque. It had been converted from a temple of the Virgin Goddess Athena to a temple of the Virgin Mother of God when it became a church, probably in the 6th to 10th century. and then it was converted into a mosque. The first cannonballs went through the roof. The building was more or less intact. Blew up the munitions, blew up the gunpowder. The fire raged for 3 days. 700 women, children, and old men lost their lives like that. So if you think 9/11 is a phenomenon of the modern period, think again. The destruction of a monument of real cultural heritage, and the loss of major lives go hand in hand, and they always have. And here are some representations of, this is one representation of the Parthenon being blown up. And the drawing that you see on the lower right is my friend Manolis Korez's reconstruction of what it looked like. So there was originally a Christian bell tower that was then converted into a mosque. I've had actually the privilege to go up. There's a little spiral staircase, and I went up, and then there's a gap about 1 meter, and then you have to take a leap of faith. And then you're on the back of the west pediment of the Parthenon, which is great. And there was Manolis with me, and I said, "You are one lucky man." And he said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "You get to see this view whenever you want to come up here." He said, "This view disgusts me." I was taken aback. I said, "What do you mean it disgusts you?" He said, "Look at this mess of Athens. Look at these concrete buildings." He said, "If German and Greek and English and American scholars knew, and French scholars knew the damage that was going to be done to Athens, they would have recorded much more than they did." So this is a view of the Acropolis from the Hill of the Muses, where Morosini set up his cannons. You can still walk up there today. It's one of the finest views of Athens. And some of these drawings were romantic or romanticized depictions, like this one by Leroy, a French artist. And here are two on the left by Leroy again, but on the right by Stewart and Rivette, two Englishmen that really did these wonderful scale drawings of antiquities, many of which were either melted into lime, the marble was taken down and put into lime kilns, camina, and melted down to make cement, and other stones were taken and built into later buildings. This little temple is about 150 meters from where my apartment is in Athens. It no longer exists. The only evidence we have of it are the drawings by Stewart and Rivette. Many of the monuments are well preserved, however, like this. This is the Philopappos monument on the Hill of the Muses. And here are the two men that made these drawings and descriptions. And here are some of their other drawings. And by the time we get into the 18th century, Greece becomes really fashionable. There are novels being written about and all sorts of exciting things happening. And people want more and more and more illustrations. They don't want just the text of Pausanias, they want pictures. How many of you write diaries or diary descriptions of your visit to the Acropolis? How many of you have been to the Acropolis? But how many of you actually get postcards or take your own photos? Most of you, I suspect. So this is Schinkel's really over-the-top, very Bavarian-looking landscape of ancient Greece and a temple being built. And I'm pretty sure the Greek workmen did not work in the heroic nude. But that's another lecture, that's another story. And just some more. Now, compare this. One of the big things that happens in the 19th century is photography. Invented in 1839. We didn't have photos before then. Can you imagine a world without one of these? It's really hard to now. That was the ancient Greek world. But they had their own noticeables. But compare this painting by Edward Dodwell with this photograph by Petros Moraitis. And this is my photograph of the same Sunion. This is where Byron left his graffiti on the temple. And this year is the 200th anniversary of his death. He went to Greece to fight in the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, and he died there probably of malaria. Do I have a volunteer to recite some Byron for me? No takers? 'Tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot shame. Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of thy Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae. Place me on Sunium's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I can hear our mutual murmurs weep. There, swan-like, let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall never be mine. Dash down yon cup of Samian wine. Not bad, huh? I could have had a career. I could have been a someone. So what I want to do now is to show you that buildings and places can have social biographies, just like we do. And I want to focus on this. Now, here is Dodwell's 1805 image of the Acropolis. How are we going for time? And you see the Parthenon. This is the Ottoman governor's mansion. And you see all these houses. And this is the earliest, this is actually an engraving after a daguerreotype that was taken in 1839, the very year that photography was invented, but the daguerreotype was destroyed, okay, in the making of the engravings. The earliest daguerreotype we have of the Parthenon is this, it's Giraud de Prongy, and it dates just a few years after the invention of photography to 1842. And this is Petros Moraitis' Parthenon in 1870. There are Greeks in traditional Evzone dress, Europeans all over the place, and he always puts a Greek Orthodox priest in there for good measure. You don't want to put jujus on things, so you get the priest to be in there as well. This is the American, William James Stillman's. He made a whole slew of photographs from the Acropolis, just beautiful things. And it's very different to this, which is Leo von Klenz's painting. His imagined Athens of what Athens may have been like in antiquity, a sort of Bavarian neoclassicist dream. And look at this photograph. And what's interesting about these photographs is that they often record things that are not written about, or things that we don't know much about. We know, and this is material from the excavations, from the demolition of Ottoman period houses. We know that they were thrown off, but we didn't know where they were thrown or where they were carted to. Look at this photograph by Demetrios Constantine, and it shows the dumps. And these are the dumps before the big excavations of Cavadias and Cavaral. And look at this tower. Now, this photograph dates to the 1860s. Check out this photograph that dates to about 1880. The tower has gone. The dumps were moved and placed in Makriani. This whole area is now a street with hundreds of apartment buildings. And every now and then, colleagues of mine in the Greek Archaeological Service who happen to be digging in this dump say, I found a shirt that joins with a shirt from the Acropolis. Well, yeah. This earth comes from the Acropolis. This is where they dumped it. Incidentally, the person that paid for the demolition of this Frankish tower that dates to the early 13th century AD, it's Byzantine, was none other than Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator of Troy, Mycenae, Tiryns, Orchomenos, and so on. And then Martin Parr's wonderful photograph, sort of caricaturing tourist groups on the Athenian Acropolis. And in turn, through these buildings, Greece influenced the West, and it did it profoundly. So it becomes one of these two-way processes. So here are two views of the real Parthenon. How many of you have been up to the down to the Nashville Parthenon? Yeah, quite a few of you. Can anybody tell me what building this is? It's close. It's the Supreme Court of the United States. And I show it because, let's go back to the Parthenon, it's 8 columns along the front. It's one of the few buildings that has 8 columns along the front. The Supreme Court has 8 columns along the front. The Parthenon had Doric capitals. This has Corinthian capitals. But hey, you know, we can do certain things. That's not a biggie. That's a quibble, not a debate. And what we can do now with photography, with LiDAR, the new iPhones, is it the 14, has an inbuilt LiDAR. You can do a 3-dimensional model of just an entire landscape, if you like. Just great. So I want to show you some great illustrations, particularly from the Athenian Agora, by this guy, Pete de Jong, one of the finest artists of the 20th century. And he worked on many archaeological sites in Greece for many of the great archaeologists. And he also did caricatures, not only of great archaeologists, but of himself. This is himself, or Kyrios Mechanikos, because that's the way the workmen referred to him, Mr. Mechanic. He was an architect and an illustrator. And back in 2006, I had the privilege and great pleasure to do an exhibition in the Benaki Museum in Athens on the watercolors. There were over 450 of them that I found in the Athenian Agora that he had made. And all of them had been published, or most of them had been published, as miserable black and white illustrations. And I wanted people to see the originals. So this was the invitation, and this was the exhibit that I did way back when. And he did everything. The interior of the Queen's Megaron at the Palace of Minos at Knossos. Here's an exterior view of the Palace at Knossos. He was the one who did the restoration for Sir Arthur Evans in the 1920s and 30s, in the later 20s and 30s. This is the Palace of Nestor in Messenia. This is an interior view. Just look at the details. Like one of the overseers giving a very Minoan-looking guard a hard time. Like, where were you last night at 12 noon? This is the courtyard before the entrance into the main Megaron at Pylos. And here's just some wonderful details of the guard and of again, a very Minoan-looking king in a Mycenaean palace. And these are Bob McCabe's photographs of the great Pete de Jong when he was making some of these illustrations in the 1950s. And one of his finest illustrations was of the Stoa of Attalus. And this is one of them. And there he is. This guy here, the arrow points. You see him here with the first director of the Athenian Agora, T. Leslie Shear. I'm the fifth director. And I'm the only one that has nothing to do with Princeton. My four predecessors were all either professors at Princeton. One was also a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And my immediate predecessor did his PhD in Princeton. Go UCLA. And these are just two of the caricatures. It's a whole book. Rachel Hood wrote a wonderful book on these caricatures. This is the first director, T. Leslie Shear, who liked a martini or two or three. Ask me later to tell you what Dorothy Parker said about martinis. And he painted this caricature of him sort of drunk as a skunk with a wine kylix on his head. And this is an Ionic capital that he painted from the 5th century, a Hellenistic part of a terracotta sema, a gutter, from a Hellenistic building, the so-called Middle Stoa. This wonderful Mycenaean, this dates to about the 14th century. This wonderful ivory pyxis. And my own period, the early Iron Age, he not only made this painting of this jug, but he rolled out the decoration so people can see the whole thing. And there's been a lot of scholarly blood shed as to whether these are Siamese twins or not. And we do know that Nestor says at one point, I actually fought the Siamese twins, the Actorioni Mollioni, when I was a young man. He was bragging. But that's another story. He also made these drawings. And this is a wonderful child's potty. And this is young Konstantinos in this potty. And the person who figured this all out but never published it was the great Peter Corbett, who was a curator at the British Museum. He died young, probably from post-traumatic syndrome. He was a fighter pilot flying a Spitfire during the Battle of Britain in the Second World War. And it just really kicked his nerves. He never attributed it, so I got Kathleen Lynch on board. And we now know that this was actually painted by the Gorgon painter. It's not in Beazley. Beazley never attributed it. And we made the attribution to the Gorgon painter. And here are some illustrations of what these potties are. So they're potties and high chairs. Now, how many, I know there's a lot of Greek American women in this audience. How many of you have cooked moussaka? There's a couple of hands. Now, a moussaka, you have to fry the potatoes, you have to fry the eggplants, you have to do the meat separately, the bechamel separately. The dish is designed to keep the woman in the home while the guy's at the cafeneon drinking raki or coffee with his friends. What's wrong with this picture? And here they are, and it was the same in classical antiquity. And so these high chairs cum potties actually kept the baby in place. We have numerous illustrations. This is what Peter Corbett found out. And talk about experimental archaeology and the social life of things. Well, there were many babies that were put into it at various times. And the one that I used for my book on Pete de Jong was young Konstantinos. And every time they put a child in there, you know what the child did? They peed. This is why we have conservators. And sometimes it wasn't only number one, it was number two as well. One of the young girls is actually the previous director's daughter. I should probably get her permission to show these. But don't say a word to John Camp. And this wonderful black figure, Crater, perhaps by Exekias, probably by Exekias, although there's some doubt. This wonderful white ground cup. And this great Roman ivory statuette. Everything was found in the Athenian Agora. It's a great site. This is what it looked like before it was conserved. And in the 1930s, there was no ivory conservator. So who did it? Josephine Scheer, the wife of the first director. And she did a wonderful job. And I'd love to show this example of Gamla Uppsala in Sweden about the importance of images. This is a drawing of these Viking tumuli. There were once somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 of them. Today, there are fewer than 300. And that was only because of farm action. And I picked Sweden because there are a few places that are as politically correct as Sweden. And these wonderful tumuli, often with Viking ships and burials of chiefs, completely destroyed, the majority of them. This is happening all over the world. Some of my colleagues are actually recording this annually, the amount of damage to things that were surveyed on the surface in northern Albania. And I want to close this lecture by bringing in a few objects in Cleveland and things that are similar in the Agora. And how do I put this politically? My aim here is not to showcase the differences between objects from the ground, excavated responsibly. Once you dig a site, you can't re-dig it. You actually ironically destroy it. So if you don't record it properly, you've lost all this evidence, which is really important. That's how we know where the objects were, how they functioned. Context is all important. So it's not so much to showcase the differences between objects from the ground, but also objects that are collected responsibly in museums. And I'm happy to say that one of my best students is one of the most politically correct curators in this world, and you're lucky to have him, Seth Pevnik. If anybody wants to see that picture of the injection in his butt, let me know. But I want to show you that actually the two are complementary to one another, that they go hand in hand together. And here again, I want to talk about my own history. I was born in Australia. That's why I talk so funny. My grandparents were born in Asia Minor. My parents were born in northern Greece and migrated to Australia. And now I'm here. We've been refugees for 3 generations. And we're not the exception, we're the rule. This is the story of modern Greece. My first ever visit to Greece was in 1979, when I was in my early 20s, as an undergraduate student to take part on the excavations at Methone. I myself, the first time I ever came into contact with classical antiquities was not in Greece. It was in the Nicholson Museum of the University of Sydney. Museums are important. And one of my favorite statements was by a truly great archaeologist, Christos Doumas, the excavator of Akrotiri, that wonderful Bronze Age site on the island of Santorini. And Christos just once said to me, Greek antiquities are our finest ambassadors. We don't want them all back. We don't have space to have them all back. Let them be where they are. Let them be enjoyed by people because they show Greece. But there are certain things that are metonymic. And this is where the Parthenon comes in, and its cultural biography, its social life. This is a building, you look at it, and it's metonymic because it stands for Greece. It's like looking at the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben in England, or the Mall in Washington, D.C., or the Statue of Liberty in New York City. It stands, the Statue of Liberty stands for America, for the ideals, the values, what America stands for. And if the head or the whole Statue of Liberty was in the British Museum, had things gone a little differently in the 18th century, how would you feel about it? Would you want it back? I mean, the French hadn't already given it to them, but I'm just making this up as a rhetorical exercise. But I'm being honest about it. And I teach every year an undergraduate GE course on an intro to Greek archaeology, and I talk about this with my students. And I said, I want reactions. How many of you are blasé? 1 or 2. How many of you couldn't care less? 3 or 4. How many of you would be pissed off? Bang! The hands go up. This is my alma mater. This is where I first came into contact with antiquities. So very quickly, Cleveland. And I want to compare a couple of objects from the Athenian Agora, which were found in context with a couple of objects in the Cleveland Museum of Art, for which we don't have any context, but I can reconstruct a context for you. Okay? And these were all responsibly collected before 1970, so they're kosher. Okay? So look at this amphora with snakes. And this is the one in the Agora, and this is the one in Cleveland. This is actually by a vase painter that I've actually written a couple of articles about, the painter of Athens 894. What a boring name. I wish John Cook named him something else. But there you go. And another geometric pot, this is in the Athenian Agora. It's again a watercolor by Pete de Jong. And this is a pyxis, a toiletry box. This is the sort of thing that women put their cosmetics in, their jewelry in. This one was purchased in 1923. Cleveland on the right, Agora on the left. Now, let's go back to the Cleveland amphora. It's red. The Agora amphora is this pale color. So what accounts for the difference in color? Well, we know. The Agora pot was actually smashed in a pyre in a sacrificial fire associated with a tomb, and it was broken up into many fragments, broke apart, either smashed onto the pyre or placed there, and it just blew up, as it were. And Pete de Jong, when he made the drawing, actually shows you, you see the stuff in this lighter whitish gouache? They're the parts that are missing, that were never found. And so this is why the color is different. We know this from the context. And we also know that the snakes, or we hypothesize that the snakes on the shoulder, on the rim, are part of a chthonic belief to do with the underworld. Because we're dealing with a cemetery that predated the home of the Athenian democracy. So I'm warning you, I'm going to be showing some skeletons. Okay? So here's a good geometric tomb, and you see the first director of the Agora, T. Leslie Sher, and there's Pete de Jong, and he's about to start drawing it. Now, the Cleveland amphora that you see on the left would have been placed whole exactly in a position like this in a tomb. It's the only way it would survive complete. Okay? And it's in fact very similar to the vase that you see in this tomb from the Athenian Agora. So here's the geometric pyxis from the Agora. This is it with its lid, with the horses on top. And oftentimes, and it's the same is true, it's never been published in a photograph, it's not on the website of the Cleveland Museum, but Seth showed it to me in the storerooms yesterday. The underside of the Cleveland vase is perhaps even more elaborately decorated than this geometric pyxis from the Agora. So there's the Cleveland vase again with the horses, very similar. And here's a tomb of a little girl with a whole bunch of these pyxides put into place. And some of them are placed with their lids facing up. Some of them are without their lids, or the lid has been put to one side. And this one has been placed upside down to show the underside, which is just as nicely decorated as the rest of the vase. So we can reconstruct the sort of tomb that the Cleveland pyxis comes from. Here's another tomb that I published. And believe it or not, this is how it looked like in the 1930s when they dug it, and when they continued the excavations. Half of the tomb, the upper part of the body, had been completely destroyed by a Turkish period Vothros, like a cesspit. And in the half of the tomb that was preserved, look at all these pyxides. There would have been twice as many placed all over the body of the deceased. I showed you this white ground, and I show it to you because it's the same technique exactly as this wonderful, what have I done? This wonderful lekithos in the Cleveland Museum. And it shows a burial stele with the deceased in front, and next to the deceased, a mourner. And you see this big egg thing? Well, we see it again here on this other vase from Athens. And in the 5th century BC, there was a good relationship between these bottle shapes, are known as lekithoi, and you can actually see them here on the steps of the tombstone. And the representation that looks like a giant egg is the tumulus above the burial. Okay? So here's some more details. And these vases actually show us the whole process of death. People taking lekithoi and kanun, kanara, these big sacrificial platters to a tomb. And here you see people, paying their respects to the dead. And again, the deceased in front of his own grave. And we also have scenes of mourning, of people tearing their hair, beating their breasts, scratching their faces. It's the whole story of death. And also putting ribbons, tying ribbons around a tombstone, because that signified that the person who's buried there is beautiful. And we also have some images just dropped out. Some whole slides when we did the conversion, but that doesn't matter. We have here Hermes Psychopompus, who ferries the dead to Hades, to the other world. Here he is with a woman. Here is Charon, the guy that rows the boat. And you have to, people in Greece in the 5th century were often buried with a drachma in their mouths to give to Charon, to pay Charon so he can take their soul across the river Styx. Here he is. And here is Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death, carrying the body of the deceased right in front of their own gravestone. And the finest example of, there's Thanatos written from left to right, and death, Thanatos, and Hypnos, sleep, written from left to right. And just some more. And this sad story of a warrior leaving a woman, his wife, his sister, his mother. He's died in battle. And we see tombstones like this all over the many cemeteries of ancient Athens. And many of the tombstones are actually marble lekithoi. Do you have one in the collection? Yeah, there was one that we saw, yeah. And this is what they look like above ground. This is the Keramikos Cemetery in Athens. And here is a picture of a tumulus. So this is the mound that's placed over a single grave or above multiple graves. That was the strange egg. And these are two tombs that have been reconstructed from controlled excavations by Olga Alexandri in the National Museum of Athens. And you see the dead with numerous lekithoi. This was the vase for the dead. And death is, after all, one of the same rites de passage, the rites of passage, that we all go through today. Birth, initiation, marriage, and death. And it was Arnold van Gennep who figured this out and wrote a classic anthropological treatise on the subject. And ironically, death of all of these things is the one that we can probably see the best archaeologically. We don't see childbirth with the same sort of immediacy. We see marriage, oftentimes, and sometimes we see initiation, but death is overwhelming. But I don't want to fit, and here's another great tomb. This is the Isis grave in Eleusis. You can actually see the cremated remains in this pyxis. I don't know if that was the curator at the Ulysses Museum or whether they were actually found in that position. But I want to finish with this on a rather happier note. And I want to talk a little bit about Socrates, a glass of wine, because I don't know about you, I'm really ready for a glass of wine. And about having a drink and shooting the breeze. Socrates was really good at that. And this is a crater in Cleveland, purchased in 1924, that has on one side written in overwhelmingly large, it's the only example. Seth has studied this for many years and he can't find another example with such big letters. And what does it say? It gives the name Simon. And that's it. Not Simon is good, Simon is beautiful, Simon's a stud. Just Simon. Simonos. Oh, the text has disappeared here. And here is this wonderful avuncular character, Socrates. And he used to, at the height of his intellectual powers, when he was in his 40s and 50s, he used to hang out in the Stoa of Zeus Eleftherios. And after he went to the Stoa of Zeus Eleftherios, he went to the home of Simon the cobbler to have a drink. And they would shoot the breeze. And Simon was a, philosopher himself, and Socrates liked hanging out with him. Oh, and this was supposed to go over but something's happened to the slides, but let's not worry. And his hangout was the Athenian Agora, the place where it's now my hangout. And this is the home of Simon. And if you look just here, there's this little stone here, which is an inscription. There's the inscription. And you can just, if you're in the front couple of rows, you can make out the inscription. And this is what it looks like. It's that. And it says, Choros ime tes agoras. I am the boundary of the agora. When the American excavators found this in 1938, bang! They found the Athenian Agora. Okay? And it's right next to the house of Simon. And so this is the Agora in the 5th century, the end of the 5th century. There's the Stoa of Zeus Eleftherios. And the house of Simon the cobbler, the shoemaker, is right here. And this boundary stone is there. And we have fragments of several of these. We have 2 of these boundary stones in situ in their original place. And we have about half a dozen more fragments. So they were set up in different parts of the Agora to denote very clearly what was public land as opposed to private land. Now, look at Socrates. Few people living 2,500 years ago have the name recognition that this guy has. And he never wrote a word. We only know about him from the writings of others, primarily Plato and Xenophon. I mean, who would talk about me if I hadn't written anything? How did this guy get away with it? But why is this the house of Simon? You may well say to me, John, why is this the house of Simon? Why isn't it just some other house? Well, we have some evidence. There's the Horos inscription, and that's all important, because Plato tells us that the house of Simon was adjacent to the Athenian Agora. It's built right up against a Horos inscription of the Agora, a boundary stone. But the American excavators in the 1930s also excavated a well, and in that well there were animal bones. And all the bones were the lower legs of cattle that are essentially inedible. They don't have good meat on them. But that's what survives when you're pulling the skin off the animal to get leather. What are shoes made out of? Leather. There were also a bunch, hundreds of them, all rusted iron hobnails that are different from normal Greek nails. These are nails associated with boot making. And there were about 50 bone rings for the shoelaces. And then there was a smoking gun. There was a base of a broken wine cup, a kylix, with Simon's name on it. So there's your vase here in Cleveland. You can go and see it in the galleries. And this is the base of the Agora, Simonos. And many of you are thinking 1 and 1 equals 2. But that's jumping to a conclusion. You've got to be really careful about this, because there are problems. The text has all disappeared, but that doesn't matter. One of the problems is that Simon is a really common name. Another problem is, if you look at this, the first O is an omicron. And on the Agora signature, it's an omega. Now, your vase in Cleveland dates what? To 480, 470? About 470. This is a fateful date because Socrates was born in 470, 469 BC. So the vase and Socrates were born at about the same time. Okay? The biggest problem in this is not only that Simon's name is written differently, it's not in the same handwriting, but that's not a big issue, but it's the date that's a problem. The Cleveland crater is circa 480, 470. This dates to the very end of the 5th century BC. Socrates was born in 470, 469, and he died by drinking the hemlock in 399 BC. If you come to the Athenian Agora, I'll show you around. I'll show you the Stoa Basileus, where he went for the Archon Basileus to determine if there was enough evidence to send him to trial. And I can show you the house of Simon, where he drank his wine and shot the breeze. So the date means that the Cleveland vase and the Agora kylix have nothing to do with one another. They're not related. It's a different Simon. And a final picture of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, dating to the very end of the 18th century. And thank you for your attention. Do we have time for questions? Late, yeah. Probably not. Okay, so I'll just put it on to the last slide.
Thank you, John. That was a lot of fun. And thank you again, everyone, for coming. I just want to remind everyone that we'll have another Collis lecture almost exactly 1 year from now. By then, the renovations should all be done, so we'll be back across the street at the CMA. But please mark your calendars and come join us next year when we'll switch gears away from ancient Greece and into the Byzantine period. Our speaker will be Alicia Walker, who will come to us from Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, speaking on virtue and adornment in Byzantium, beautiful bodies in the Christian East. So thank you again. I'll see you next year and hopefully sooner. And thank you again, John. Have a great afternoon.